This is something I was asked to do for, it was like a high school age keynote speech. And if you've ever been to any of those, or if you've ever done any of those, you know what they're like. And you see the kids turn off, because it's the same old story every time. Reach for your goals, go for your dreams, aspire to be the greatest, which is all wonderful advice for kids. But they've heard it a million times, and it's so nebulous that they're kind of like, well, what does that mean? It's like wishing somebody a Merry Christmas. If everybody does it, it doesn't mean anything. So I thought, well, what can I do to try and say something else to kids? And then I've sort of adapted this for adults as well, which might actually get to them. And it's like, well, how about being that person in the room that sometimes is the person that nobody likes, but it's because they're right. And that can be the most important part in your job. If you're the one who says, well, wait a minute, I don't think that's correct, and everybody else has already agreed to do something, nobody likes you in that moment. But as those of you who've had careers in engineering know, 5 years later, they tend to be the person getting awards, and the people say, well, we were always behind you, we always knew you were right. You know, it's funny how the politics of big engineering institutions work that way. So what I wanted to talk about was somebody in history that actually did that. So let's go back to 1969. First footprints on the moon. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin land on the moon in 1969. That was only decided in 1961. John F. Kennedy said, when America only had 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience, a quick up-down flight of quarter an hour, the president said, we're going to go to the moon before the end of the decade. So this is something I wanted to talk about with kids, and I think it's a great thing to talk about with adults too, which is, you know, there's only 8 years in that time, 61 to 69. We don't seem to be able to get our act together to write a blueprint in 8 years these days. How did they manage to do that from 15 years to walking on the moon in 8 years? You would assume that everybody all had the same idea, they all agreed on what they were going to do, and everybody on day one all went, okay, we know how we're going to do this, we're all going to go in this direction, we're all going to do this plan. To make anything like that happen in 8 years, from going from 15 minutes to walking on the moon. But no, that kind of wasn't what happened, and it was one of those things that everybody had different ideas, and people with different ideas, you know, in history tend to be very famous, but not particularly well liked in their lifetime. People like Galileo, Copernicus, the kind of people who were right, but they were the irritants. They were the one who were saying, wait a second, it looks like the Earth is going around the sun, not the sun going around the Earth. The math seems to prove that this is the case, and I can show it to you. And they take that to somebody, and the person says, well, you know, that doesn't agree with this book I have over here, so I'm sorry, I'm going to have to burn you at the stake. You know, these things didn't generally go well for these people. But these are the people we remember. We remember the people who were in power, often as the villains now. We remember these people for the heroes, but I'm sure that doesn't help when you're being burned at the stake. It doesn't make you feel particularly good about yourself. So, but these are the people who are important. These are the irritating people. The difference, as I was telling the kids, is you can't just be irritating, you've got to be irritating and absolutely right to the point where you have to buck the system because you know that everybody's going off in the wrong direction. And something like the moon landing, which was not so much about science and engineering, it was about beating the Soviets on a national stage to show that countries that were deciding whether to go communist or whether to go capitalist to come this direction. This was about the future of the world at the time. This was a very important thing to do. So here's a guy who's not so well remembered as Copernicus, Galileo, and some of those other people. This is John Houbolt. Some of you, I know, worked on the Apollo program. Some of you worked in engineering. You may know who John Houbolt is. Believe me, the general public doesn't know who John Houbolt is. This was a very minor engineer working out at NASA Langley. And for those of you who know, where the NASA centers are, it's still around. But in the early 60s, Langley was kind of like the sticks. You know, the big stuff was happening in Huntsville, where they're building the rockets. They were beginning to get together in Houston with the astronauts. Washington, D.C. had all the power. That's where all the decisions made. And Langley was kind of where the aerospace engineers were, who were considered like the nerds doing designs about obscure mathematical stuff. They were doing incredibly important stuff, but they weren't particularly valued. John Houbolt was one of those guys out there. So in 1961, how was America going to get to the moon? At the time, we were flying hypersonic rocket planes like the X-15, which was right here in Southern California, built down around LAX. So this was the way that people were in science fiction and in science fact were thinking, this is how we're going to get further into space. We're going to have airplanes, they're going to go very high. Then we're going to have rocket planes like this one, which can do like what Virgin Galactic are trying to do again now. Just get into space far enough to say you're in space, but you can't really stay in orbit. You're going to come right back down, but technically you're in space. So the idea was, well, let's just keep building bigger and better ones of those, maybe like the Space Shuttle or something. Let's do something where we have a plane that goes into orbit. Once we've got that underway, then let's build a space station, probably a big wheel in the sky so we can make artificial gravity. We'll have those space planes come and dock with that space station. We'll start building a homestead in the sky. That seemed like a natural progression. As you can tell, this picture is from the movie 2001. This is not something we actually did. This is how people were thinking in science fiction and in books, and going back as far as Jules Verne, the century before. This is how we were going to gradually get into space. It made sense. It was a natural step-by-step thing to do. Once you do that, how are you going to get to the moon? Well, maybe you send bits up to that space station and you have like a big garage, a little bit like our basement here. You have people putting bits together. You send those bits up into space bit by bit, you put a big rocket together, and then you send it to the moon. Or maybe you launch a big rocket from Earth all the way to the moon. You get to the moon, you've never been there before, but you're going to assume you can land an aircraft essentially on its tail, which, as you know from the exhibition we used to have in the museum here, an aircraft that used to land on its tail. That's not that easy to do on Earth. Never mind going all the way to the moon on a rocky surface. You've got to hope you're going to find somewhere flat, be able to bring something down on its tail. It would be incredibly difficult to do, but this is how all the movies at the time, again, this is from a science fiction movie, never happened, this is how they thought they were going to do it. Once you do that, you're going to have people in that control cabin at the top come down an obscenely long ladder all the way down that thing, get down to the surface, start going around picking up rocks, and then they're going to have to carry them all the way back up that ladder, back up into your cockpit. This is a ridiculous way of doing it, but this was about the only way they thought they could do it. Send a whole thing to the moon and come back. The other problem when you're on the moon is, if you've ever seen rocket launches from Earth, I mean, they're still going on, where you see there are tens or hundreds of thousands of engineers, either at the pad or on call around the country, ready to troubleshoot any problem. People can be flown out to fix something. When you're on the moon, there's you. There's no big operational team to help you, and particularly if the radio goes out, you can't even talk to people. You could leave somebody outside to try and fix something to make sure you launch, but then that person's left behind. So this seemed like a very complicated system to do when you've got no support from launching from the moon. So engineers were beginning to see problems and no idea how to do that in 8 years. So then what do? You launch that back from the moon back to Earth. That's the reason you're carrying those wings, because you're going to need something to come back through Earth's atmosphere. So essentially you're carrying a huge set of like jet aircraft wings, landing them on the moon, bringing them all the way back, only to use them in that, it'll be about 500,000-mile round trip journey, just for those last few minutes coming back through the atmosphere. So that's a huge amount of stuff to take with you, just to use at the very end of your mission. The rest of the time you're in the vacuum of space, you don't need wings at all. So there are some problems with this plan, but this is the only way people thought they could do it. Von Brun, you probably know him, the giant of rocketry, and you can see this is his office in Huntsville, literally giant rockets behind him. These models were the kind of things he actually built. This is the guy who was not so much the hands-on engineer, but he was the leader of the engineers. He was the guy who was incredibly influential. Anything he said, people tended to follow. And at this time when nobody quite knew how to do it, his word was better than anybody's, because he'd actually made the rockets so far. And he thought this was the way to go. He thought sending something out of Earth orbit all the way to the moon, landing directly on the moon, coming back to Earth, was the way to do it. So his word was very influential at the time. So that left them with two options, they thought. You can either send that rocket directly from Earth, straight out to the moon, land, come straight back, or that second option I mentioned, which was getting to a space station, or maybe just having the bits dock in Earth orbit without the space station, going all the way to the moon. This terrified the engineers, and you can imagine at the time, it's scary enough to launch something from the Earth all the way to the moon. Now, imagine launching two things, going faster than rifle bullets around the Earth, and just very gently, these rifle bullets have got to kind of nudge themselves, and just nose themselves together and join up. The speed you're talking about, the technologies they're talking about, very, very difficult. The good thing is you're only about 100 and so miles up, so if something goes wrong and there are people up there, they can come splash down somewhere, you can be back within minutes. But how to do this, the math was incredibly difficult, the technology was not developed. So scientists were thinking, to be able to do this in 8 years, to be able to rendezvous in Earth orbit, this was a huge leap of faith. We do this every day now, of course. We do it with manned rockets, we do it with unmanned rockets. There's a space station up there right now, and people doing this every month. At the time, this was terrifying. They thought this would be enough of a leap. To be able to solve this was going to be a huge deal. So along comes John Houbolt, and he's looking at this, and he's thinking, well, I think there's another way of doing it. the proposal was to build this enormous Nova rocket on the right, which would be about the only rocket they could build capable of sending that whole thing to the moon and back. Only if you could solve the rest of the problems, how to land with wings, all that kind of stuff. This would be, you need a rocket that big. Or you could launch a couple of rockets of that smaller size, put those bits together in orbit and send out one big rocket. You still got all those issues of the wings. What John Houbolt was looking at is saying there's another way of doing it. You could do the whole mission with one medium-sized rocket. And it would be about half the weight of that large rocket. You could do the whole thing, and he thought he could do it within those 8 years. But it took another leap of faith. He wanted people to start thinking about lunar orbit rendezvous. So instead of doing this, what was already considered terrifying idea of launching into Earth orbit and docking up, now you send the whole rocket out to the moon, and that's where you start undocking and docking things. His fellow engineers thought this was insane. They didn't know how to do this in Earth orbit. Now we're talking about going 3 days away from home, going into lunar orbit. When you're in lunar orbit, unless you've got a rocket that can bring you back, you're stuck there. If that rocket doesn't work, the Apollo 11 astronauts and folks would still be there. How do you get back? What happens if something goes wrong? Even the radio signals take a couple of seconds. It's a 3-day journey, a 250,000-mile journey. And he's saying we're going to do this untried idea of docking and undocking out there. Just on that basis, they said, no, we don't even want to think about this. But what he realized was, this is how you save weight. Instead of having that enormous rocket landing on its tail, bringing those wings, coming all the way back, what you do is you send 2 spacecraft out there. You send one which is like the ferry, the one that has a heat shield, the one that has everything you need to go to the moon and back. The other one's kind of like your Uber ride to the surface. You have a little taxi that can go down and come back up, and that's all it does. It doesn't need a heat shield, it doesn't need wings, it only operates in the environment of the moon. So it can be tiny. You could strip out the seats and have the guys standing up. You could have them sleep on the floor, you don't need couches. You don't need any aerodynamics, it could be exactly the shape that engineering requires. And once you're done, once it comes back up, you throw it away, and you come back in the main ship. That would make the rocket about half the weight. And he knew this was the only way America was going to get to the moon by the end of the decade. But nobody wanted to hear that. And it makes sense. You look at what they were scared of, they had no idea how to do the simple stuff. It totally made sense why they were scared, but he was also right. And he got the math behind it, he was trying to preach it to people, and he kept getting turned down by his bosses. This was his idea, and you'll see we have models of this downstairs, so you kind of know the end of the story. Here's the one that lands on the moon. As you can see, totally unaerodynamic, just boxes. You have a foil, like a mylar foil on the side, which was actually so thin that if they turned around in the spacecraft the wrong way and punched an elbow, they would punch through the spacecraft. It was that thin. You didn't need much more. And then you have the other one which has the heat shield, just like we have with Gundrop downstairs, Apollo 9. The heat shield's under there. You have everything else you need. Power, water, big main engine to get you into lunar orbit, get you out of lunar orbit. That's what you need to come back home. He knew this was the way to get to the moon and back by the end of the decade. And it was a very different idea from that science fiction stuff. Instead of the sleek, silvery stuff, you had something that ends up looking like this, something that looks pretty ugly, but nevertheless will do the job. And pretty small. You can see it doesn't have to be very big, just to take people to the surface and back. But a terrifying idea. You imagine in 1961 being told, this is where you're going to undock and redock, and that's how far away any help is. Didn't want to think about it. So this is where Houbolt makes his first big career risking leap. He goes to Bob Seamans. Bob Seamans is the #2 of NASA at the time. People like Houbolt are not supposed to talk to people like Bob Seamans. That's like it's like me going to the Vice President of the United States because I don't like how the museum's being run or something. This would be like me going over every possible head you could imagine. He writes a letter to Bob Seamans and he says, I'm a voice in the wilderness, but do we want to go to the moon by the end of the decade or not? And Bob Seamans, this is where you need more than one person to be the irritating person or the person willing to take the leap. Bob Seamans looks at this and his initial thought is like most bosses would be, who is this guy? Why is he not going through channels? He's already been turned down by his boss, so therefore I probably shouldn't, out of respect, look at this. But then he starts looking at the math, he starts looking at the ideas, and he goes, this guy's onto something. Let me have some people check this out. So Bob Seamans takes a risk as well. Bob Seamans takes that leap to go, I'm going to listen to somebody who's technically I shouldn't even have to deal with because they have a good idea. Bob Seamans starts talking to people. Gradually people say, this idea has merit. And then another huge leap Bob Seamans in the picture on the left here talks to Wernher von Braun. Wernher von Braun has spent his entire career pushing for going to the moon in one big leap. It's good for him too. He gets to make giant rockets. That's what he wants to do. If they make really big rockets, to go to the moon that way, he has more work. He risks his entire reputation and everything he's been working on for about 25 years to go, you know, this guy's onto something. And eventually, Wernher von Braun at a meeting stands up and says, you know, I think we should go this way. Despite everything I've been saying the last couple of years, we need to go this way. And like often in office politics, once one person says that, everybody goes, oh, yeah, let's all go that way. So the NASA turned within about a year and started doing what Houbolt had said to do, which was to start designing this 2 spacecraft system. So only about 7 years left. Took about a year to make that decision, but nevertheless, a huge decision when they hadn't actually practiced any of this stuff, didn't know how it was going to go. So as NASA progresses with that, they start launching people on the Mercury program. The Gemini program comes along. We have a model of this downstairs, as you know, in the spacecraft gallery. A 2-person spacecraft. They start rendezvousing in Earth orbit. They prove they can do that. But it takes some years after they made that decision. They finally prove they can actually do that in Earth orbit. They still haven't gone all the way out to the moon to do that. But finally, that's what they do. They go out to the moon. They do this undocking and redocking. They land this tiny little spindly spacecraft on the moon in Apollo 11. Which serves as its own landing base. It's its own launch pad. So the bottom half stays on the launch pad, and then with a very fail-safe rocket, we have one of those in the, I think it's under the Blue Angel down there, about the most fail-safe rocket you can get. You put 2 propellants in together, they automatically ignite because you don't want anything to go wrong. That top section takes off, brings those 2 guys back to the mothership to go back home. And this is what it looks like when it comes back. This is a picture Michael Collins took of Armstrong and Aldrin coming back from the lunar surface, and you can see how fragile the spacecraft is. You can see where it's sort of, the aluminum-looking mylar there is all kind of folded. This is a very fragile spacecraft, but it's all it took to get to the moon and back. In fact, if you were around in 1969, you were in this picture. Everybody who was alive in 1969 is in this picture apart from one guy, that's Michael Collins, who's behind the camera. So, somewhere in there you are. Very, very risky thing to do. So many things could have gone wrong. And once again, in office politics, if something had gone wrong, Houbolt would have been the guy they would all pointed the finger to and said, this was your idea. This is why America didn't beat the Russians to go to the moon. But this was the way it happened. But because it happened successfully, of course, again in office politics, everybody goes, you know, we always knew you were right. And Houbolt had left NASA by then, although he later came back. But in a very magnanimous thing, Wernher von Braun made sure he was in mission control in the viewing area when Apollo 11 landed on the moon. And as they landed on the moon, von Braun turned around and kind of pointed at him like, this is because of you. Which is a very nice thing to do because the spotlight had moved on from him at this point. But he made sure he was recognized. And other people recognized him too, his hometown. Gave him a parade, they named streets after him, they did a lot for him. So, as often happens, the person who's the irritating one, if they're right, they end up getting the kudos in the end. But it could have gone so differently. And I think that's a lot of the reason why things like this happen today. Just the other year, I don't know if you remember, we have rovers all over Mars right now. They're getting bigger and bigger. And every time they land one, they're like, how do we land an even bigger thing on Mars? They keep coming up with ideas that they never tried before. Each of them is incredibly risky. With Mars, you are months away. It takes hours for the signal to come back and forward, and you're not sending people. So you have to rely on a computer system that is going to make its own decisions, because the time the signal comes back from Mars, it's already too late. It's going to say we landed or we crashed. There's nothing you can actually tell the spacecraft to do. So landing on Mars, they were beginning to send bigger rovers. They put them in giant airbags and they bounced them across the surface. So rather than have a huge heat shield and rockets, which is too heavy, bounce them across the surface in big airbags and then deflate the airbags and the rover drives off. By the time you get to something like this, which is about as large as an SUV, you've got to go even more imaginative. So the other year, they came up with the Skycrane, which I think is a great word. I mean, any engineer wants to use the word Skycrane every day in their job, right? This thing has rocket engines and a big tether. It comes down towards the surface of Mars, it lowers this rover down, and it has to rely on sensors that absolutely guarantee to know that this rover is down safely, securely on the surface. Only then those tethers cut, this rocket moves away and crashes. So many things could go wrong. You get a wrong signal, that crashes on the moon. This doesn't cut properly, or that goes in a different direction, the rocket lands on top, destroys your rover, and billions of dollars have been wasted. But this kind of imagination, this kind of success, and this is an absolute success, it worked the first time. You can't try it before, you just got to do it. It worked, and I think that's because of people like John Houbolt, who sort of set the tone for people being able to go into engineering meetings and go, I got this crazy idea, and everybody going, that's okay, we listen to crazy ideas. We don't always go with them, but we're going to hear you out. So I think that's kind of why that happened. So that's my talk. I know there's a lot of you who are actually involved in that. A lot of you were actually part of that, and thank goodness you were, because San Diego, Southern California has been the place where this engineering innovation has happened. And like I showed you with that last slide, it's not just the 60s, it's not just the 70s. Thank goodness there are people out there at NASA, up at JPL and other places that are still doing this. Imagination is not the limit, it's really the budget that's the limit right now. So if we give them some more money, we could be all over the solar system right now. So if you folks got any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, you never mentioned Lyndon Johnson, and he was actually the driving force for he's the one that got the space program financed.
Absolutely. Oh, I could go for 10 hours on this nonsense, as you know. Yeah, LBJ was very important. Most people credit Kennedy as being the guy who set it in motion. As we know, like just this month, the current president has made a promise to go back to the moon. The president before that was talking about the moon. The president before that was talking about Mars. The president before that was talking about the moon. Every president makes a big speech about the space program. It's not that difficult to do. What's very difficult is to get Congress, the money, the political will, and more than 4 years in a row of everybody agreeing to do something. With Kennedy, Kennedy was smart. He was told by his advisors that if everything went right, America could land on the moon around 1967, 68. So he was intending to be the guy who made a speech at the beginning of his presidency, become a two-term president, and be the guy to welcome the astronauts back from the moon at the end of his presidency. And it was, just like Nixon, JFK taped himself, and there are some very interesting tapes where JFK says, I don't care about going to the moon, I care about beating the Russians. And that's what it was to do with. It was to do with the Cold War. And who knows what would have happened had he been a standard president. Part of me wonders whether if he hadn't become the martyred president of America, whether Nixon would have continued with it. Because Nixon was his sworn political enemy. And yet Nixon was the one who welcomed back the Apollo 11 astronauts. But LBJ is the forgotten hero and all that. LBJ is the guy who took a lot of JFK's promises and then ran with them. And he was the guy who realized there was a lot of science and technology needed to come into the deep South of America. And that's where Huntsville, Alabama, where Houston, Texas, where Stennis Center down in Mississippi, Louisiana, all of a sudden you see these high-tech places, high-tech jobs come into parts of the South that never had them. So he reinvigorated the American science and tech industry while putting Americans on the moon all in one go. And he was really the guy who did it. But because he didn't make the initial speech, and because he was out of office by the time it happened, he's kind of the middleman who often gets sort of forgotten. Yeah.
One thing they never talk about is how it kind of saved the American economy too. It was a huge make-work project. It was just a gigantic. And the other thing along with that is, I was reading in the paper the other day, someone was saying, government doesn't really invent anything. It's private entrepreneurs that do it. Well, I had to remind him about our GPS, but think it's come out of the space technology. About everything we have today, it seems like.
Well, people talk about Elon Musk and all the private industry stuff and going to Mars, and they're like, well, NASA's out of the game now, and now it's all private. And people forget that, a bunch of you worked mostly for private contractors in Southern California, not for NASA. There were NASA overseers at Downey, there were NASA overseers at North America and all these places, but it was North American that were building the X-15, the Apollo Command Module, the Apollo Service Module. It was Grumman that was building the Lunar Module, and there were NASA people there because it was their funds, but they were private contractors making it. It's not that different from what's happening now. People tend to forget and overlook the incredible contribution here. The model right now is not that different. And in terms of public funding, absolutely. It's not, people say, why should we be spending money in space? It's as if we're like putting it all in a big rocket and sending it up there and setting fire to it. It's all working for jobs right down here. And you drive through Orange County, and you look at when all those houses were built. There was nothing there before aerospace, and all of a sudden, boom, huge suburbs because everybody got a job. And then you look at when the houses stopped, when the aerospace industry stopped. So you can't tell me that wasn't good for California and America in general for that. When all that money is there, you can go by and see it. It's all there in houses and development.
I like to remind students that are sitting there playing with their telephones that the internet was once called the DARPAnet.
Right. Almost everything we know. I mean, anybody who's had any heart issues in this room, everything that was monitoring your heart was because of stuff they designed for astronauts. And you know, people say, well, we could have spent that money on Earth instead. If we put it directly into medical stuff, we'd have got more out of it. Sure, but that wouldn't happen. You know what budgets are like. Money gets pulled around all over the place. This is one of the greatest spin-off stuff we've had. And we also managed to walk on the moon, which is a pretty cool side benefit. Yeah.
Do you have any idea why they chose such an incredibly complicated way to land that module on Mars? Because when I first heard about it, I thought, this is outrageous, it's never going to happen. Why they chose that complicated method?
Sure, it's all to do with weight. You know, if I decided to send this pen to Mars, I would need to have a rocket that would be able to slow it into Martian orbit, so it doesn't just burn up, get it out of Earth orbit, get it into Earth orbit. So every ounce of this pen would require this much propellant, which then requires a bigger rocket, which also weighs some more, so then you need some more propellant to launch the weight of the rocket, and the numbers just keep going up. So every ounce you can shave off something like that will save you in the end. So when they landed Viking on the moon in the 70s, they went for the big, brutal way. You have a big rocket, a big aeroshell, slows you down, lands you with a big, like in the science fiction movies, you know, rocket lands slowly, you're on the surface. When it comes to sending something bigger, the size of the rocket to land something the size of an SUV on Mars is bigger than any budget you could get. Plus, if you're trying to land something where you're looking at the local soil, you're driving around and taking samples, you don't want it to be contaminated with this huge rocket plume you've just put over everything. You want the rocket to crash away, and you want to come down relatively pristine. So for a couple of reasons, it's worth looking at trying to do something a little bit more outrageous. And yeah, it's an outrageous idea, but compared to trying to find the money in Congress to build a big enough rocket, it's simple, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm one of the generation that grew up with the models of the LEM and the Apollo. Was our openness about and our excitement about it what led the Russians to pretty much look at doing much the same thing with their landing system?
Yeah, I mean, it was all to do with beating the Russians. You know,
Yeah.
the science on the moon, the geology on the moon was wonderful. They found stuff about, I mean, we have moon rocks downstairs, which they learned more about how the solar system was formed by some of those rocks we have in our display, and ones like them than anything. But it was a benefit, a side benefit. It was essentially, both sides have nuclear weapons. How do you have a war for the very first time when everybody has nuclear weapons? You really don't want to have a hot war. You want to have a cold war. You want to have a war of ideas. You want to have and if you look at those pictures coming out of Russia of the handsome, charismatic, good-looking sort of cosmonauts, it was all about winning hearts and minds. If you look at the pictures on Time and Life magazine of the 7 original American astronauts all wearing silver spacesuits, there's no operational reason to get people who fly a single-seater spacecraft, 7 of you all suited up one day in spacesuits, all standing there, unless you want a really good front cover of a magazine. And that's what they were doing. It was Cold War warriors dressed like knights in silver armor, going off to fight the Russians. And whoever got to the moon first, it was seen, were going to be technologically superior. Countries like India, Korea, Vietnam, places that were like, well, which way should we go? That was a good way of trying to beat people over, and it was a lot cheaper than nuking each other, essentially, not cheaper in many ways. So it was all to do with beating the Russians. The Russians were smart, though. The Russians were doing their program in secret. They were 2 or 3 years behind America. They could have, if they really pushed it, put a human around the moon first. But they waited just long enough for America to move up the program and beat Russia by a couple of months. At which point the Russians, again for propaganda, were really smart. They said, well, we were never planning to go to the moon. America was like racing itself. We were always going to build space stations, and it was only in the late 1980s and early 1990s did everybody's suspicions come true, when all of a sudden these big warehouses in Russia opened up, and you found there's the lunar lander that they built, that they were training people for. They were ready to do it. They were shut it all down. The second America landed on the moon, they're like, well, why bother? Why come second? Let's just pretend that we were never going to do it. So they were very smart in their propaganda too, but it was all about propaganda. It was a nice side benefit of a Cold War, because I mean, wars generally don't have good side benefits. This was one that happened to have a good side benefit. Yeah.
Did they come up with the idea on their own about how they were going to get somebody to the moon, or did they somehow find out what we were going to do and then choose to do that?
So
That's kind of what
the American program was wide open. Some of the technology was classified, but the how-to was deliberately done that way. When Eisenhower looked at it at the beginning, he decided this was going to be a civilian open program. Sure, they started off using the Atlas and the Titan rockets and things which were military weapons for civilian use. Some of that was classified, but when it came to how the program was going to be run, and then as you get into Apollo, those rockets were designed solely to send humans, then it became very open. Russians had access to all of that, but the Russians, reversing engineering stuff is actually quite difficult, and we're talking about they still had valves and stuff like that. They weren't into the point of circuit boards. I mean, this was very primitive, what they were capable of doing, even if they wanted to. So the Russians had the equivalent. They had big rockets that were capable of launching nuclear weapons, so they could use those, put spacecraft on top of them, put people up. When it came to going to the moon, they had rockets capable of doing that, but at that point, a 3-day mission to the moon and back was kind of pushing the limits of what they could do with the spacecraft. Their lander was pretty similar, but it was a one-person lander.
Yeah, I was wondering if the lander was there, would they have come up with the idea of a lander on their own, or did they hear about it first?
It's similar enough to the American idea that I have to suspect they did copy the American idea. It was a one-person one, and also unlike the American one, it was a lot more primitive compared to when the Americans came back. There was an inside docking hatch, so you could go through. The one-person landing with the Russians would have to have done a spacewalk out to the other spacecraft and gone inside, so it was pretty primitive. George?
We got an intelligence briefing 30 years ago that told us that within the county of San Diego, there were at least 6,000 active Russian agents. And they weren't just stealing military secrets, they were in all the high-tech companies around here trying to get everything they could.
I believe it, yeah.
And one startling piece of proof, they developed a space shuttle called the Buryat.
Mm-hmm.
Snowflake.
Yeah.
Looks exactly like ours.
It does. Yeah, and they flew it once. Now, the Russians were
With
so
nobody
convinced,
in it.
and that was a case of Brezhnev paranoia, because he was convinced that the space shuttle was a military weapon. And it was designed to launch from Vandenberg in a polar orbit, drop off a spy satellite, pick it up on the next orbit. But he was convinced it was more. He was convinced that it could be used for orbital bombing runs. Why would America be building a space plane if it didn't have a huge military reason? So Russia put a huge amount of money into developing a pretty identical looking space shuttle. By the time it was finished, you're right at the end of the USSR. It flew once, it flew unmanned, which is pretty impressive. The American space shuttle never flew automatically, always had people inside. Flew once around the Earth, came back, and then it was put in a warehouse and it never flew again. Huge amount of money just to try and equal with the other side over something which didn't actually turn out to be a real worry.
Makes me wonder what the Air Force was thinking when they came up with the.
There's a lot of money and a lot of stuff that goes into experimental planes that we never know about, or some of us know about but can't talk about. So yeah, there's a lot of that happening. Yeah.
They interviewed Von Brun and asked him what pioneer he studied. He said Goddard, right? American Goddard.
Mhm.
Robert Goddard.
Yeah, Robert Goddard was one of those guys. Again, he was the irritating guy. He was the guy saying, rockets are the wave of the future. He was out in New Mexico launching rockets on his own money. The Smithsonian gave him a little bit of money for a while, but then that kind of ran out after a while. The people who tend to be those lone wolves out there doing their own stuff are the people who tend to get marginalized in their lifetime. In fact, I think it was the New York Times even wrote an article saying, well, Goddard's theory is ridiculous because when a rocket gets into space, there's no air, it can't push against anything. So it's not going to go anywhere. So what a crazy idea. And then I think it was the day Apollo 11 landed on the moon, they finally printed was it 50 years later, they printed a retraction of that article saying, apparently we were wrong, engineering. So it is sad sometimes those people don't live to see themselves become, not necessarily become a hero, because a lot of those people don't care about getting rewards, but what they do care about is the respect that their work deserves. And certainly Goddard's widow spent the rest of her life going to award ceremonies on his behalf. He unfortunately didn't live for a lot of that, but he lived long enough to see that the tide was turning in his favor. But yeah, Von Brun, a very interesting guy. He was Nazi Germany building rockets that were firing into the civilian area where my father grew up. My father was close enough to hear them go off. I might not be there if Von Brun had been more successful in his work. So very interesting, you know, how the tide of history turns, and at the end of the war, despite them being Nazis, both countries said, these are the best rocket engineers in the world, we need to try and get them. So both the Soviets and Americans tried to get hold of that technology. And Von Braun and his people realized life was going to be easier in America than it was going to be in the Soviet Union, so they came here and managed to redeem themselves in many ways from the Nazi world. Absolutely,
Our
yeah.
German scientists were better than their German scientists.
That was the story, yeah.
Yeah, they failed to mention that Von Braun was a major in the SS and in charge of allocating slave labor at Peenemünde.
Yep, I mean, Von Braun died in '77, before a lot of that stuff, but they would already sent Arthur Rudolph, who'd been one of his deputies, was sent back to Germany. He's like, we can strip you of your citizenship or you can go back. Because those guys were, their version, of course, is we were military, working for our country, we were told what we're supposed to do, they would have shot us. But nevertheless, the weapons they were creating were being built by slave labor in mountains where more people died as slaves building them than were ever killed by the weapons. That's a very morally difficult thing to ever argue successfully. Had Von Braun lived into the 80s, I don't think he would have escaped some kind of censure. Certainly, most people assumed he was the head of NASA in the 60s, but he could never have become the head of NASA because he was an SS officer, yeah, and that kind of stuff eventually does catch up with you. So he may have died early in his favor, you know.
Well, I was assuming that the U.S. government was aware of all this, his
They were.
Oh yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
you read the book Flyboys, some of the medical experiments that people did in Japan in World War II, and those people were like, we need to know what you know. So we're going to kind of just pretend you didn't do this stuff and get the information. A lot of stuff happened at the end of World War II that was kind of swept under the rug, that now you see people in their 90s who are, you know, the last commandants of a concentration camp, people going after them because they're the last ones left as symbols. There were tens of thousands of people like that at the end of World War II that they just kind of wrote off because they wanted to know what they knew. It was a very cynical decision, but in terms of information, in terms of military information, that tends to be how things run. It tends not to be on moral grounds, it tends to be on, we want this information, and we'll kind of let a lot of that go.
In 1939, there were 40,000 Americans who were members of the German-American Bund.
Happens a lot. Happens a lot. So yeah, that's always kind of the dark side of the Apollo program. It was built on extended Nazi technology, but then you show me a war weapon that doesn't have a dark history, I'll be very surprised. So.
Two questions. Every time you see, like the Space 2001 movie, they had the huge thing rotating around. How big would that actually be? Would it actually work to provide enough gravity?
Right.
Have you ever talked to anybody that's explained it? That's number one. And number two, Scott Kelly, I know you went to see the thing I did.
Yeah.
He said the first astronauts to the moon will most likely be women. Maybe you could explain that.
So as of now, no woman has left Earth orbit, which is amazing to think. You know, we've had women command space shuttles, we've had women command space stations, we've had a woman commanding a space station while a woman commanding a space shuttle has come up to dock, and we've had some incredible advances. We've had people of every nationality, every ethnicity up there, but when the moon landings happened, America was choosing astronauts. There was no gender or description in the job description, but you needed trained military jet test pilots. And as America had women test pilots in World War II, at the end of World War II they said, thank you very much, we don't need you anymore, you can apply to the airlines as a hostess, and that's the closest you'll get to flying a plane. Right at the end of World War II is when, of course, the jet comes in. So women are all of a sudden excluded from any advance in the latest jet aerospace technology. So when NASA comes looking for astronauts in 1959, it says we need people with these requirements. And the only people that had those requirements were guys. So which means that when you look at all the 12 people who landed on the moon, they're all white men. That was very much that time. By the time you get to the Shuttle era, now the first 3 women who came out of military test pilot school, NASA picked all of them. 2 of them commanded the shuttle, 1 of them worked in mission control. So the second there were qualified people, the military allowed, NASA took them. So now you see women in all those roles, but we haven't been back to the moon ever since, which means that we haven't seen any women leave Earth orbit. So I would be very surprised if when whichever country goes back to the moon and Mars first, and the Chinese have done this, they've had the first Chinese woman spacewalker, the first Chinese woman in space. Not just from the point of view they're qualified people, but also it's still about headlines, it's still about propaganda. And which country doesn't want to send the first woman to the moon? What a great headline.
It was the eyesight issue I was referring to.
When it comes to eyesight, there's some weird things going on. You know, to go to Mars, we need to know what happens to people for years in space, because you don't want to go all the way to Mars and find that somebody's legs are not strong enough to stand up when you get there, so they land on Mars and they can't get out of the seat. So that's why the space station is doing all this work right now. People can spend a year or more in space. They're finding, you know, some of us probably have osteoarthritis, we have bone issues that come along with age. Same thing happens in space. As you're up there, your body stops fighting gravity. All of a sudden, your bones can start to deteriorate. So they're finding constant exercise, some drugs, some medication, things like that need to be happening to go to Mars. Also, something's happening with people's eyes that they're not really sure what's happening, but it seems like when there is pressure that our body is constantly fighting to put blood into our heads against gravity. When we're in space, of course, everything changes around. The heart initially keeps pumping that, and the head gets very full. And then after a couple of days, it realizes it don't have to do that anymore, so your body adapts. But that seems to mean that your optic nerves get squeezed in a way that they don't on Earth. So people are coming back from space in extended periods of time and finding significant vision deterioration. That's obviously something that could be huge if that happens badly to everybody going to Mars. Right now, they're finding gender differences, which is kind of interesting. It seems to happen less to women than men. Also, it doesn't seem to be so huge that it's a huge vision loss. They're just finding people who've got slightly less vision than they had when they came back from Earth, enough that eyeglasses can deal with it. But it's the kind of thing you want to fix before you go to Mars, that's for sure. So lots of different things going on.
And
I want to make a statement.
the rotating.
The rotating space station, sorry, I knew you had another question. So yeah, you watch 2001 in 1968, that's what people thought you'd need in space. You want to recreate an Earth environment. You want to have a giant spinning space station, and as you spin, you kind of get stuck on the outside of it, so it would be like a floor, and you could walk around. But the whole point of going into space is to have zero gravity. The experiments we do are way more interesting because we're in zero gravity. So the whole point of having that artificial gravity kind of went away when they realized we don't want to go into space to recreate Earth, we want to go into space to work in space. Plus, there's also another effect, you know, if you've ever been on a fairground ride, even if it's pretty big, you don't feel like Earth gravity, you feel like you're spinning. And they can make a bigger and bigger wheel, but at the same time you're still going to get this effect of sort of listing to one side and moving, and it's never going to feel the same as Earth gravity. It's actually quite disorienting, so it's not really something you want to do in space for a number of reasons.
If you're floating in space
Mm-hmm.
and you have this thing spinning, what's to keep you on it? Why doesn't it just spin around while you're floating?
If you're in the middle, you'd float. The further out you go to the edge, the greater the gravitational effect would be, and if it's big enough, like a mile wide or something, you could be essentially standing on the floor and almost feel like you're on Earth, but you'd have to build a huge thing up there. Yeah.
Could you speak on the Avenger, the one that we lost? You know, the Avenger?
Oh, the new rocket thing that just...
No, the Avenger that exploded didn't...
Challenger.
You mean
Oh, the Challenger, sure. Yeah, we lost two space shuttles, the Challenger and the Columbia. We have a beautiful memorial to them down by the gift shop there. Both of which were avoidable, but again, this is engineering, which is, they both were lost for kind of the same reason, which is, after the Apollo era, America wanted to make access to space routine. And that's why all of a sudden you saw people who were not career astronauts train within 6 months, go up, do a science experiment, come back down, go back to their normal careers. It was supposed to be everyday routine, like a big truck that went into space. You could take huge satellites, you could take ordinary people, and go up and back. That's how it was sold to Congress to fund it. The trouble was, anytime you send something at Mach 25, it's not like a jet airliner. You know, you've seen jet airliners where the entire roofs come off, and people have landed still sitting in their seats and survived. You do that at Mach 25, the whole thing disintegrates and burns up. The speeds, the tolerances, the temperatures, it's another whole realm. And so ever imagining that this was going to be routine was already a no-go. But that's what NASA was selling, because that's what they needed to fund the space shuttle. So they were trying to make it routine. To do that, you've got to have a quick flight rate. You've got to turn it around all the time. So there was a lot of pressure from politicians to make the shuttle fly a lot very quickly. So then you've got engineers who are honest, reasonable people saying, you know, we've got a problem here. As we're flying this brand new, untried space plane, we're finding things going wrong. We're finding that as it takes off, there's vibration from the launch pad, which is causing shock waves, which is actually damaging the shuttle as it's taking off. Okay, we can fix that. We can have water jets that will suppress that. Okay, we fixed that. We're finding that if we launch within certain temperatures, the rubber rings on the solid rockets will actually get so brittle that they won't seal, and there's the possibility of some fire coming out. Well, you know, we've got to launch all year round. We can't not do that. So let's kind of work on it bit by bit, but let's keep going. Okay, now we've had a launch where there's actually been some flame coming out of that. This is a problem. Well, did we lose the shuttle? No, we still got back. So, okay, let's fix it, but let's keep going until we did. And that's what happened with Challenger. Eventually they launched at a temperature way below what they promised. There was a rubber seal that was supposed to seal at the moment of ignition and stop some hot gases getting out. It didn't quite seal because it was too cold. That had happened on previous missions, but it was like dodging a bullet. It never actually, by the time that rocket was done, it was okay. It never burned all the way through and did any damage. This time it went all the way through, did some damage, they lost the entire space shuttle. So that stopped them. They went back, they said, okay, we can't do this as an operational routine thing. This is something we do have to consider the space shuttle as a very different kind of vehicle. As time went on, they got back into that exact same complacency, where now you had issues with a big external tank which created fuel for the space shuttle main engines, and then it came off and was ditched in the Indian Ocean and burned up. There was foam on it, and the foam started coming off on launch. Every other rocket before that, the spacecraft was at the top, with the big rocket below it. When you're with the space shuttle, it's attached to all the other three rockets. So you've got the possibility of bits coming off those rockets and hitting the space shuttle. Space shuttle's made of a very fragile tile, and if you damage that, that's your heat shield gone. So the engineers were seeing foam coming off, they were seeing some damage, but they're thinking, it's foam. How much damage can foam do? I mean, you throw a big piece of foam at something, it's not going to damage something like a space shuttle, right? As the Columbia took off, a piece of frozen foam came off. It's going so fast that as it comes off, by the time it hits the wing, it's going hundreds of miles an hour. Anything going 100 miles an hour is probably going to cause some damage. But they thought, no, it's still a piece of foam, it's going to be fine. Shuttle gets into orbit, it comes down, and in the exact same spot in the wing, which they saw the foam hit, the plasma gets in, the flame gets in, and the space shuttle is lost on re-entry. And they still don't believe foam could do this damage. So they get a piece of shuttle wing, and they get a piece of foam, and they fire it on a ground test at it at 100 miles an hour, and they think it's just going to disintegrate. And they're incredibly surprised when a huge hole opens up into the shuttle wing, and they go, okay, that's what happened. So sometimes engineers they get complacent about what they're seeing. Normally it's because of pressure from their bosses. We've got to keep flying. And in both those cases, they'd seen issues happening. They hadn't fixed them because it had always been okay until they lost both shuttles. At which point, they essentially said, we're going to fly for another few years, but we're going to retire this because it turns out to be simpler to go with something like Apollo. Apollo is pretty hard to, you could fire foam with that thing downstairs, it's probably going to be okay. Sometimes creating a more technologically advanced thing like a space plane can actually make it more difficult to get into space because it didn't save any money in the end, but it did create a lot riskier program. So now they're going back to things that look like the one downstairs. Yeah.
Yeah, I wondered, when the foam was striking the vehicle at hundreds of miles an hour, is it because it's still in the atmosphere, and the atmosphere is decelerating the foam and the rockets maintaining its speed or accelerating a little bit?
Yeah, they were mostly out of the effects of atmosphere, but it was mostly to do with the difference in speed. What they were thinking was like, because it wasn't that far away, it was maybe twice, 1.5 times the length of this room. But when a shuttle is going that fast and accelerating that fast, to have something coming off that's going the same speed, it doesn't take very long for that shuttle to massively catch up with it or ram into it.
That's like a vision of just how fast that thing is accelerating, if it can make that much difference over that distance.
Yeah, it is. And it was one of those things, even when the engineers had a pretty good idea of how it happened, until they did that firing on the ground and saw that hole, they still didn't believe something that made like a styrofoam cooler could actually punch a hole in the wing of an aircraft, but it did.
Well, so much for that.
Well, I hope that gave you a little bit of insight into the year. Thank you.